For many, the death mask of Tutankhamun is the most iconic ancient Egyptian artifact. But what if we told you that this sparkling testimony to the past hides a secret that could rewrite history? What if the most famous find from the ranks of the pharaohs didn't actually belong to the mysterious child king at all, but to someone completely different? Well, then we would have arrived at the core of an exciting theory that is forever providing new material for discussion among experts. But what are the arguments in favor of this controversial thesis? What traces have already been discovered on the mask? And above all, to which powerful ruler, or which powerful ruleress, did the golden death mask belong? From today's perspective, it seems almost absurd. Although the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings was nothing less than the greatest archaeological sensation of all time, the reign of the pharaoh buried there was not particularly remarkable from a purely historical point of view. In fact, more than a few researchers believe that the young king would never have achieved such fame if Howard Carter had not stumbled upon his richly endowed tomb in 1922. And, strictly speaking, it was not so much the mummy of the pharaoh that brought the long-hidden sight into the headlines, but rather the smorgasbord of precious grave goods that Carter described at the time as a strange and wonderful jumble of extraordinary and beautiful objects. The most valuable and now most famous of these beautiful objects is the magnificent death mask of Tutankhamun, in which more than 9 kilograms of gold and numerous precious stones were incorporated. But who was the king to whom this outstanding artifact was given on his journey into the afterlife? And why is the death mask still overshadowed by gigantic question marks to this day? To understand this, we have to turn back the wheel of time to 1390 BC, and thus to an era that was several decades before Tutankhamun's birth. At that time, a certain Amenhotep III was still in power, who, together with his wife Ti, ruled for almost 40 years over an empire that enjoyed extraordinary prosperity. But the wealth and stability were followed by an uprising. After the death of Amenhotep III, his son Amenhotep IV ascended the throne. He turned away from the old gods of his forefathers and instead placed the sun god Aten at the center of worship. In the 5th year of his reign, the pharaoh changed his name to Akhenaten, which means he who serves the Aten, and he moved the religious center from Thebes to the cult site of Akhetaten, 290 kilometers away. Here, Akhenaten served as high priest of the sun god Aten together with his principal wife Nefertiti. But what happened next can no longer be unequivocally determined from today's perspective. The end of Akhenaten's reign can, to put it mildly, be described as confusing. Either he ruled together with another king before his unexplained death, or he was replaced by an ominous ruling duo after his death. Most Egyptologists estimate that one of these rulers was in fact Nefertiti. The second is the mysterious Semenchkar, about whom almost nothing is known. What is known, however, is that around 1332 BC, another pharaoh entered the ancient Egyptian stage, a 9-year-old boy who was initially known as Tutankhamun, and thus as the living image of the Aten. The enigmatic death of the child king. But soon after his ascension to power, the young king and his wife, Anaxapartan, a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, returned to the Thebes to put an end to the worship of the Aten and to revive the cult of Amun. In this context, it is not surprising that the child king changed his name to Tutankhamun, and yet it is likely that these recent upheavals did not arise from the mind of the actual ruler. In fact, Tutankhamun was subject to the enormous influence of his advisor Aj, who had his personal interests, in particular the rejection of Akhenaten's policies, represented by the young pharaoh. But then, just 10 years after ascending to the throne, Tutankhamun died, and his death remains an open historical mystery to this day. In addition to malaria, a chariot accident, a fateful encounter with a hippopotamus, and gangrene after a broken leg, are all also being discussed in this regard. For a long time, however, a brutal blow to the skull was considered the most likely cause of death. After all, there is a gaping hole in the back of the mummy of the pharaoh. However, in 2005, computer tomography revealed that the injury was caused during the mummification process and thus after Tutankhamun's death. But no matter how he died, Tutankhamun was apparently hastily and inconspicuously buried in a small tomb that was not even intended for a powerful ruler, but for a private person. But ironically, it was the actions of his descendants that paved the way for the greatest archaeological sensation of our time, because they had successfully managed to extinguish the legacy of the so-called Amarna kings. The location of Tutankhamun's tomb was quickly forgotten. And so it came about that some 3,000 years later, Howard Carter opened not only the lost burial chamber, but also an untouched time capsule, which still contained over 5,000 artifacts. What the X-ray examination revealed. And as mentioned, the 5,000 artifacts included the legendary death mask, as well as one of the most remarkable works of art in history. But unfortunately, museum staff do not always handle the irreplaceable treasures of the past with the utmost care these days. This was demonstrated by the unfortunate incident that occurred in the Egyptian Museum in August 2014, when the mask was removed from its display case for cleaning. Its beard fell off as a result of an accident. Those responsible did not hesitate for long and immediately tried to reverse the involuntary shaving with epoxy resin. But unfortunately, the beard was no longer centered as a result. In the end, the problem was solved with the help of methods from the past, and a German-Egyptian team of experts repaired the mask using beeswax, a purely natural material that was already used by the ancient Egyptians. And while the museum staff were later ordered by a court to pay a fine for the permanent damage to the artifact, it seems almost comical in retrospect that the X-ray examination of 1967 was carried out to examine the death mask for any damage and alterations. In fact, the mask was to be presented at a major exhibition in Paris, and it was the first time it had ever left Egypt. However, the fact that the ancient object eventually ended up in the X-ray tube was not only due to the inspection, but also to the aim of gaining new insights into ancient Egyptian goldsmithing. While the initial information was still rather rudimentary, the more recent X-ray examination of 2007 shed a little more light on the historical darkness. And at the end of the analysis, the conclusion was that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic kingdom did not use pure gold to make the mask. The highest purity gold can have is 24 carats, but in the case of the death mask, researchers identified a lighter 18.4 carat shade for the face and neck, as well as a 22.5 carat gold for the rest of the artifact. In other words, the Egyptians had added another component to their gold recipe, namely copper. This was most likely done to make the material more flexible and easier to work with. They probably then hammered the gold sheet into shape. But another secret of the mask was only to be revealed by the lost beard. Who was the golden death mask really intended for? In order to restore the object to its former glory, it was subjected to a complete 3D scan in advance. During this process, the experts discovered another small golden tube inside the beard, which enabled the Egyptians to attach the symbolic head of hair to the mask. But what does this mean? Could it be that the beard was added to the death mask at a later date, and that it was not originally intended for Tutankhamun? Well, some Egyptologists think this is quite likely. In detail, a 2015 study concludes that the mask was by no means made for a teenage king, but actually for a queen. And it wasn't just any queen, but Nefertiti herself. And that's not all. On this basis, the proponents of this theory speculate that ultimately most, or even all of the grave goods in Tutankhamun's tomb were intended for Akhenaten's wife. One of the biggest proponents of this theory is Nicholas Reeves. Several years ago, the Egyptologist and director of the Amarna King Tombs project pointed out the strange air holes that adorn the mask. And for an adult male king, it would have been highly unusual to have his image depicted with air holes. Furthermore, he claims to have recognized that the artifact depicts a different face on the inside than on the outside. But while these traces were still vague indications rather than incontrovertible evidence, the study mentioned above then came up with somewhat more tangible arguments. Specifically, Reeves was able to uncover traces of earlier writing in the cartouche of the Tutankhamun. According to this, the throne name of the pharaoh, which was Neb-Cheperuto-Re, was written over another throne name, which Reeves and his colleagues reconstructed as Ankh-Cheperu-Re. And basically, we know this name in two versions so far. In the first, it was used without epithets by Semenchkare, and thus by the pharaoh whose background, as mentioned, has been lost in the shadows of the past. In the second case, the name was used again together with an epithet for Akhenaten's co-regent, Neferraton. And as also mentioned, it is likely that this was Nefertiti. So far, so name heavy. But then there are also the carat differences. After all, the face and neck are made of a different gold than the rest of the mask. In combination with the clearly visible soldering marks, this raises a fundamental question. Could it not be that the face of Tutankhamun was only added to the original death mask at a later date, and that the ears and the so-called Nem's headscarf actually came from a completely different person? But why would the original artifact have been altered? Was the intention to make the true owner of the mask unrecognizable? Well, who knows? Maybe the answers to all these questions are still slumbering in the Valley of the Kings. After all, Nicholas Reeves has not only uncovered some curious facts about the masks, he has also found some hidden hieroglyphs in the tomb of Tutankhamun that are supposed to prove that Nefertiti's burial chamber is hidden right behind it. And do you know what is hidden exactly under our video? That's right. Feel free to click the thumbs up and subscribe now so you never miss a new post from us again. See you soon!